Thanks for joining us on the Future Food Show. We're excited to have Nick Cooney back on the show, this time to talk about his latest and one of the most interesting projects that we've come across lately. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Alex. Great to be here.
Nick, give us a quick introduction first. We'll, of course, do a deep dive, but a quick introduction to the book, What We Don't Do.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to share my background and day job and kind of partially where this book came out of. The day job, I'm venture capital manager, founder, managing partner at a firm called Lever VC, which invests across the food and ag tech landscape, including many companies in the alternative protein space. So that's what I'm doing day to day. The book is pretty different from that world, but there is one important overlap, and that is the following. So in VC work and investment work, certainly a core thing that needs to be done to succeed is to think very analytically and quantitatively about decisions, investment decisions individual companies might make and so forth. The book itself, this book, What We Don't Do, is basically taking a very quantitative analytic look at the impacts that each of us as individuals have on the world around us. And specifically and primarily, the book is looking at that impact of, per the title, what we don't do. The opportunities we have day to day, week to week, month to month, to give up our time, of our money, of our energy in ways that would really make a difference for the lives of others, significantly reduce the suffering of others, for example. But we choose not to act. We choose to spend our money, time, and energy in some other area. So that's really what the book is about at a high level.
Great. Yeah. And I know a lot of our listeners are coming from the animal welfare, animal rights movement, but this book just maybe has a couple small tidbits about how we can save animals. It's primarily about how we can do more good in the world for everyone, and mostly actually about other people in the world.
It is indeed. It is indeed. And I certainly individually am somebody that cares a lot about animals and animal suffering. And for me, in terms of putting into practice in my own life and my own decisions, some of the sort of ethic that the book describes, for me, a lot of that work does go towards trying to reduce animal suffering in the world. And certainly that's been for several decades at this point. It will be for many decades. Key focus of my life and work, and is a guider of career choices, among other things. But you're right, the book is definitely more broadly framed. It's about just efforts to reduce suffering generally and how our choices to do or not do things can have an impact on the lives of others, be they human or animal alike, or even other areas. Our decisions of things we do or don't do can have impacts on the environment as well, for example.
So you had a couple eloquent examples to set the stage, but the core concepts that came out of it are these kind of four categories about the good and bad things that we do and don't do. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah. If we think about ethics and are we living a good life? Do we think others are good or bad people and living a good or bad life? You could think of these areas of ethical value as being in these two grids, as you mentioned. So good things and bad things, things we don't do. So there's good things we do and good things we don't do. There's bad things we do and bad things we don't do, right? When we think about ethics of our own life, if we take a moment to reflect, am I living a good life? Am I a good person? We usually think about actions. Generally, we think, okay, a good person is somebody who does good things to help others, and they don't do the bad actions that would make them a bad person. And somebody who does bad actions is a bad person. We mainly focus on that, on good and bad actions. We don't think so much about inaction, what we don't do, especially when it comes to that, what I call the fourth box in the book, that combination of good things we don't do. And that is really what the book is focused about, because that area, good actions we don't do, in my view, and the book posits that while this was not the case through much of human history, today, the vast majority of the impact that you, that I, that others have on the lives of those around us, it's actually not through good things we do to help others. And it's not through bad things we do that hurt others. Those things matter. Those things are important. It's right to put a lot of attention on them. But it's this fourth box of good things we don't do that is actually the most consequential for the lives of others around us.
And without getting too deep into this first example, and I think this was like a fictional example to set the stage, was this kind of this wealthy baron or something like that. And he essentially had the wealth to help hundreds of people from dying or getting sick, but chose not to. And he ended up dying with his wealth. And so that was, of course, I oversimplified it, but that was like the first example that kind of really highlighted this fourth category. Feel free to elaborate on what that is, or maybe if you have a different example of kind of highlighting this fourth category of good things that we don't do.
Yeah, absolutely. Indeed, I present that near the start of the book, and it is fictional, but I think it's a good prototypical example that we can then transfer over to our own lives today. And as you mentioned, indeed, in this fictional example, hundreds of years ago, you've got this wealthy merchant. By all general means, seems like a good guy, like nice to his family, fair in his business dealings, doesn't break the law, is kind, is friendly to people around him, faithful to his family, does some good things in the community, gives some patronage to some artists, supports his church, and those sort of things, right? The things that by all external measures, most people would look at this guy and think, yeah, this is a good guy. He's living a good ethical life. And then one year there's a famine that hits this town, and a lot of folks in the town, it's mostly subsistence farmers, they're running low on food. And so they knock on his door asking if he can help them. And he's got plenty of money. He certainly could help them without his own safety, health, food stores being at risk, but he chooses not to. And as a result of choosing not to, a bunch of other people in the town get sick and die over the course of this winter. And now imagine we're at the end of that guy's life, he's having his funeral, and we're reflecting on, was this a good guy or not? I think that we would view him positively in all the ways I described earlier, right? All those good things. But I think all of us with this kind of removed in time and distance and able to be pretty objective, we would view that failure to help those in need when his neighbors in need and his neighbors were dying. He could have helped them at no real significant cost to himself, and he chose not to. I think we would view that failure to act to help as a real serious black mark on the question of, did he live a good life or bad life? And it's easy for us to come to that conclusion with this random fictitious person who lived hundreds of years ago and was at quite a different level of wealth than his neighbors. But if we move forward to our own life, your life, my life, the reality of our lives today, for most of us living in North America, in Europe, and in many other parts of the world where we live in a semi-industrialized or very industrialized country, it's exactly the same. Nearly all of us have way more resources than we need, i.e. way more money and so forth, than we need to live a happy, healthy life. And there are, as we know, hundreds and hundreds of millions of people barely subsisting, barely have the food or the healthcare or similar to survive, and that are going to die preventable deaths that we can prevent by giving some of our time, money, and energy. And your point earlier about animals, when it comes to animals and animal suffering, that's just magnified 100-fold, 1,000-fold, right? The tens of billions, 100 billion plus animals that live lives of really excruciating misery and places like factory farms that we can change. Part of it, certainly not all of it, but we can change parts of it. We can spare hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of these animals from lifelong suffering at basically no cost to us, right? Like minimal, if any, difference in our happiness and our health and so forth, if we just give more of our time, of our money, of our energy to help change things and get them out of those problematic situations. And indeed, I think those would be good examples of the impacts of inaction, the impact of failing to act to help those in need when our actions could really change the lives of those who are suffering greatly.
Great. Yeah. And it's something I think this is really the core concept of the book, right? Because it's something people don't think about enough. So I was listening to the audiobook version of What We Don't Do, as I mentioned, as a podcaster, right? And the first half, I just kept thinking, like, I really want to ask you, because you mentioned a few concepts about religion throughout the stories, but you did declare yourself that you are not religious. I want to know, because I think you mentioned you had a religious upbringing. Why are you not religious, or what kind of was the turning point for you?
Sure. Yeah. And being raised religious definitely influenced the course of my life and certainly also influenced the way of thinking that the book expounds upon. Just to speak to that quickly. So I was raised Catholic. My parents are both Catholic. My parents both worked in Catholic schools for many decades, went to church every Sunday. It was always there, but it never was something I thought a huge amount about until 15, 16, 17. And that's when I started reading a few books relating to that topic and started thinking, if I really believe this, if I really believe what Catholicism, Christianity teaches, then this is really serious stuff and I should really take it seriously. And what are the implications for my life? And one of the books I read at that time is a book by Søren Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher, lived a few hundred years ago. And while he wrote this book really with an eye towards inspiring people inspiring people in his community in his time who are Christian to live their Christian values more meaningfully, more significantly, what I took away from reading some of his writing was this idea that if you believe two things. So if A, you believe something is true, and B, that true thing is really impactful for yourself or for others, then you really should structure your life around those goals. So in this example, in his book's example, and his book was called Purity of Heart is to Will One Thing. He basically makes the case that, okay, if you're Christian, if you believe in the teaching of Christianity, and obviously this is a huge existentially important thing, then what you should want in life is to do God's will, and you should devote your life to and structure your life and your decisions and your goals and your wishes and aspirations around bringing about God's will on earth. At the time, I think that resonated with me for two reasons. One, I was religious at the time. I'm starting to get into it. And then two, it just made a lot of logical sense. And I think I'm someone who probably just genetic predisposition wise tends towards like someone at being fairly analytical and like looking for logic and trying to make logical sense of things and live accordingly. So it really resonated with me for those reasons. And that general way of thinking certainly informs this book, What We Don't Do, in the sense of if it is the case, like if factually it is the case that if I spend $100 to go out to dinner tonight versus I give that $100 to help efforts to reduce factory farming or to cure blindness, that there's two outcomes of that. One, I have maybe a slightly tastier meal than I would have had at home with a bit of novelty. Or in situation two, I can cure two people of blindness, or I can spare hundreds of animals from lifetime of suffering every single year. Clearly, the second one's much better for the world, and it's much more greatly brings about the world that I would like to see. So while I'm never going to be perfect about always choosing the second path, choosing that second path much more often and trying to have that be the default rather than the exception, I think is like the right thing to do or a good thing to do. Anyway, that's how religion, I think, influenced the thinking of the book. To answer your question specifically, I got very into religion when I was 16, 17, 18. In fact, when I was 19 in my first year in college, I decided I was going to drop out of college and become a priest. And the reason for this is, getting more into religion, but also I was rather inspired by some of the activisty priests that were out there, which in the Catholic faith tradition would mainly be the Jesuits, with a sort of order of priests that some of them, not most, but a few of them had made a name for themselves over several decades, being really active in anti-war, helping the poor, other sort of movements, even engaging in civil disobedience, going to jail, doing things to really advocate for these sort of positions. So I found that inspiring. And I felt at the time that, okay, if I believe this, then I should dedicate and devote my life to these things. That evolved as I started, like that belief system evolved as I started reading from other religions. So reading from Hinduism, from Buddhism, from a few other faith traditions, reading other things. And I'd say my religious beliefs went from my default and what I was raised in, which is Catholic, to being more nebulous. And then from there into not having religious belief, or more specifically being atheist. And so that's where I've been since mid-college at this point. But yeah, it was a transition that came about from just reading a lot more broadly and thinking and reflecting on other ideas. But I do, while I'm not religious, I do think there's still a lot of value in some of those teachings about how we should live our lives and so forth. And again, without being religious myself, I do mention in the book examples from Christianity as well as a few other religions where there are very straightforward directives given to give much more of what we have to help those who are suffering. So for those who are religious, there's, especially those who are Christian, just such abundant, like explicit directives to give way more than most of us typically give to help those in need.
Very cool. Yeah. And it seems like there was like this, you did a deep dive, there was this peak, and then you realized, hey, I can take these values and apply them in how I see fit, which is very cool. And I think the examples that you used in the book were great. I think it's interesting you mentioned kind of the $70 dinner example, because it made me think, okay, at And we'll unpack this, unravel a little bit more. A lot of the book shows about how you can use money that you earn by either working more or working more efficiently to then put towards good causes, right? When we have the resources, we have time or money. It's about how you put those resources in the right place. And made me think, if you don't go to dinner, then that server who might get the tip now cannot donate their tip. So it is this kind of like concept of, if you don't do certain things, then it shifts the economic drive. But in reality, it's not so black and white. And you go on later in the book to talk about how those who are working at NGOs, then they have a certain purpose or mission. And so I guess I wanted to, as I'm talking through this, it's more of it is coming out, but I wanted to get your opinion on, if you do move that $70 and then let's say your at-home meal is $5 and then you have that $65, is the idea that $65 will go to NGOs, but what about that server that will no longer have a tip and you're taking their opportunity to donate away?
Yeah, I think a couple things there. So one, that while you're giving sort of an example here, I think it's illustrative of the fact that all of these sort of things have more complexity than an easy answer would lend themselves to. And I think thinking through those things is therefore really important. So I think good to have the illustration. To go into this very specific example, I think here we just have to think about the concrete specifics and likelihood, right? So if we thought it was pretty likely, extremely likely that the server is going to take, for one thing, the tip would be a small part of the meal, right? So it's getting divided among all sorts of things. If people produce food, blah, blah, blah. If we felt that all of those people getting our $70 are likely to themselves take that money and turn around and donate it to really efficient causes, then theoretically, yeah, there's no difference between them doing it after we have our dinner or us doing it before the dinner. But practically speaking, we know that's not the case, right? We know the reality is almost no one is going to do this. For those who do donate, most donate to causes that are not particularly efficient. So I think if we are practical, if we just think practically what's going to happen, we realize that it's very different. And anything we lose in one area, there's always a trade-off, right? So there's always some goods from anything we do, including some goods to others. Like in this case, maybe it's you help keep somebody employed and we want people to be employed and be able to take care of themselves. There's always some, or nearly always some negative downside when we do one thing and don't do the other. It's really just weighing those two of those in comparison, right? In this case, again, it all depends what you do with the money, and it requires you and or any charitable efforts you donate towards to use the money really efficiently. But if we take one of those examples of, say, restoring blindness to somebody who has gone blind from cataracts, or giving food to somebody who truly is like suffering extreme hunger day in and day out, or sparing animals from daily excruciating suffering, the value of achieving any of those things versus the value of giving someone $10 more in additional tips that night, which probably doesn't make a real practical difference in their lives. And even if it does, it's modest, relatively speaking. It's just weighing those goods. Yeah, there's always trade-offs. Nothing is purely good, purely bad. Most things are not. These situations, they're not. But I think if we weigh those things pretty honestly, we're pretty honest about it and actually think through the specifics, 98, 99 times out of 100 will come down on the side of, okay, in terms of actual impact on the world from my personal decisions, this is the better route.
Yeah. And I guess you go on to give another example of, you could donate your time and volunteer, or you could donate your money, and that might be a little bit more efficient. So I guess this is just another one of those options, right? And in this case, of course, you don't know that the server is going to donate to anything, and it's only a small percentage. So that's the clear, less efficient option. But it's interesting to walk through that. Earlier, you had mentioned that you are analytical and logical, and knowing you before reading the book and having you on the show before, and I always had this term disciplined for you. And I think now, after hearing more answers, even more. And so I just want to say that. Another thing, you mentioned something that really struck a chord with me. I think it was about the work you should do, right, on a day-to-day basis. And it was something along the lines of suffering decreases and well-being increases. And I thought that was, if I could take one phrase out of the book that I've had listened to or read so far, that would be it. I really like that. I'll pause here. Just any comments. Otherwise, we'll move on.
First, thanks for the kind words. And secondly, in terms of that phrase, yeah, for me in my own life, I want to be happy. I want to enjoy things in life, right? I want to go to the beach and go swimming and do some things I enjoy doing that are just purely to enjoy life, be happy. And I think it's obviously fine and respectable and normal to want that. So I want that in life. But the other thing, and for me, even the bigger thing than that in life is my goal is to reduce suffering and to try to reduce as much suffering as I can. Because from kind of an existential perspective, aside from just being happy and enjoying this gift of being alive, for me, it's hard to think of something else that's more meaningful, that is better for the world and just also personally makes life existentially meaningful. And again, if you forget about myself and any self-interest I have in living a life that feels meaningful, clearly that's the approach that should be the best for others around us. And yeah, that goal of reducing suffering and increasing happiness, that's my personal goal in life, is doing that as much as I can. And I think for trying to do good in the world, it is important to have some very clear objective that matters. So you have something to shoot towards, to measure yourself against, right? If you don't have a specific outcome, it's hard to measure, are you making real progress against it or not? And if your goal is a fairly wishy-washy one, or one that's perhaps not described as concretely or specifically enough, then you might not ultimately be shooting for the thing that matters most. Like I know from when I think of my own life, if I feel like I've done some things that have been helpful in reducing suffering in the world, like what were some of the reasons that happened and I ended up doing that? I think one of them is having that as this like very specific measurable goal, and then measuring against it, and then asking myself like pretty much every day, how can I be doing a better job? Like, how can I increase the quantity here, right? Just as somebody who's super money hungry every day, that might just ask themselves, okay, how can I increase my bank account more and more? Same sort of thing. But the key thing being measured is that how much suffering can be reduced. I know for me in my own life, that's been, when I reflect back on the last 20, 25 years, I think been a critical element, hopefully having some positive impacts on the world. Myself.
Yeah. And I like that you mentioned beach, because it's not to say that you would never do things that are enjoyable, like going to the beach or something like that. In fact, later on, I think in the book, you mentioned that sometimes you are more efficient when you do take a break or you do things to decompress and you don't burn out. So it's really about how to be the most efficient, make the most change, and all at the same time. There is this concept about putting yourself in uncomfortable situations to make you a better person to explore. And I want to get back to that. But first, I want to talk to you about speciesism. Maybe you can tell the audience a little bit about what the concept of speciesism is.
Sure. Yeah. I don't think it's a term I ever use in my day-to-day life. And I probably haven't uttered the word in I don't know, 10 years, something like that. It's not part of my everyday discussions. Yeah. It's not a word I use, but in terms of what it would mean. So just as racism would be treating two groups of people very differently based on their race or color of their skin, and just as sexism would be treating two groups of people differently based on their sex. And today, while in the past, those differences of treatments were viewed as very understandable, acceptable, even desirable, even justified by religion or culture, et cetera. Today, at least in many countries, we view that as anathema, right? That no, there's no reason one person should be treated better based on what sex they happen to be born or what color their skin is or so forth. And thus viewing racism and sexism as bad things. Speciesism would be same concept, just applied to what species we happen to be. And so the idea would be that, okay, if you have a human here and your pet dog there and a pig over there, maybe there's some reasons to treat those species slightly differently in certain regards, responsibility, intelligence, right? Obviously, like there are meaningful differences there. But when it comes to things that really matter, like causing suffering, really impinging on the freedom, the well-being, the happiness, et cetera, of another, is there really a massive difference between, say, the pet you have at home and a pig? Or is there really a big difference between a human being and any non-human animal? Again, like for things like law, public policy, obviously, like, of course, those things are going to be different for practical reasons. But when it comes to inflicting suffering, inflicting needless suffering and cruelty, those sort of things, killing, is there really a reason to draw that sort of very sharp distinction? Kind of a look around, is that distinction drawn? And I think when we look closely at it, I certainly do believe that there's no good justifiable reason in most cases, that it's largely just instinct. Just as racism, I think to some extent may have come out of instinct, and sexism to some extent may have come out of instinct. Maybe I'm wrong. I have no idea. I'm sure there's both cultural and evolutionary reasons, but I think that that general human tendency to view non-human species as ethically just totally separate from humans, like completely different ballgame, and in most cases, nearly no rules apply in terms of you could do anything you want to them. That mostly just comes from evolutionary baggage, right? Of we were apes, and apes were not thinking that much about the well-being of other species, and now we're slightly more evolved apes, but that those ethical intuitions haven't shifted very much from the savannah days. So I think it's mostly just gut instinct. And when we think about it more logically, when we think about sentience, ability to feel pain and pleasure, the value of a life, et cetera, yeah, I think there's some differences there, but I think there are way less between species that our society and culture would generally suggest or operate under.
I like that. Yeah. And it's not to say that this is one of those ethics or philosophy experiments with the train running down a track and you have to choose which one between an elderly person or a mother pig. The world doesn't really work like that. But I think you use the term, is there a massive difference? That phrase, I think, yeah, I think that's what you need to focus on. And you had a couple of good examples of that in the book. So thank you for that. Yeah, no, that was great. Okay, so now I want to go back to this concept of almost as if this idea that if you put yourself in, let's say, voluntary, uncomfortable positions, you can evolve from that. And it's not to say you just want to be uncomfortable, right? It's for a purpose. And you gave a couple of good examples of if you want to build muscle, you have to tear muscle. So tell us a little bit about that and how you weave that concept into the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll preface that by saying for any one of us to do a lot more good in the world, to literally save the lives of numerous other people, to spare tens of thousands of animals from a lifetime of suffering, nearly all of us can do that with literally zero discomfort. And maybe it even makes us happier because we know we're making a positive difference, right? Like most of us could take whatever number our bank account is at, we can lower that number and we're not going to feel it in our own life, right? And we could also make some changes in our own life that result in us spending less money, but being just as happier, if not happier than we are now. So all of us can do a lot more good with literally zero feeling of discomfort, other than we have to think through it a little bit, have to put in some mental energy. But generally speaking, that's the case. But then like from there, as you mentioned, I talk about in the book that it is also the case that making ourselves uncomfortable and embracing discomfort to some extent is really valuable and important in a few different ways. So I do think there's personal value in that, right? There's personal value in going through discomfort and coming out the other end to some extent, right? You don't want it to be excruciating, say, masochistic, traumatic, et cetera, but embracing some level of discomfort helps us grow as people, helps us be stronger in various ways, including personally, but also, and in this case, in the context of the book and what the book is about, embracing discomfort can allow us to do a lot more good in the world. And this is like the idea of embracing comfort and even seeking it out and relishing it is so normal in many areas of life, right? So think about soldiers. Even if they don't end up ever going to war, which obviously is the ultimate embracing of discomfort, but living in barracks away from their family, shipped around the world, you're on somebody else's clock telling you what to do all day, nearly all day, every day. It's not a comfortable life. You're embracing a lot of discomfort, but millions of people in the US and elsewhere do it every day. If you think about professional athletes, embrace a huge amount of discomfort, physical discomfort, but also just the mental effort and just general life effort of optimizing your life around your sport, right? Getting up at ridiculous hours early in the morning to practice your sport, spending huge numbers of hours changing what you eat, when you eat it, all these sort of things. Same for look at doctors, look at investment bankers. It's extremely common in many parts of life and society for people to really embrace discomfort to succeed at their chosen profession, and B, to be viewed positively by others for doing so, right? Like most of us would look at a doctor who might work at 24-hour shifts or 18-hour shifts for a couple of years in their first years of residency and saying, maybe we think the system should be a bit different, but we still think, oh, that's admirable for that person to put in that level of effort. If we think about professional athletes who do that to be top of their game, we might not want to put in that effort ourselves to be a great athlete, but we respect them for doing it. When it comes to charity and doing good, generally speaking, that's not the case. And of course, there's exceptions, right? Mother Teresa is a characterized version of that, of caricatured, I don't know the right word, person who's been made a caricature for putting yourself in situations of risk and discomfort to help others. But aside from occasional examples like that in our day-to-day life, generally the idea of embracing discomfort to do good for others is not common. There's not many models of that. And I feel like it's almost discouraged. I feel like if we think about, and this is going to be a huge overgeneralization, right? So obviously there's lots of people for whom does not apply and there are exceptions. But I would say if I were generally speaking and generalizing, the Venn diagram of the sort of people in this country or any country who really embrace this like high discipline, willing to undergo suffering, willing to put themselves to really rigorous things to succeed, take that chunk of people and then take the chunk of people who want to help others and reduce suffering in the world and make the world a better place. There's some overlap of those two things, but it's surprisingly small. And I think that for those of us who do want to make the world a better place, there's a lot that we can learn from those who do embrace discomfort to succeed in their own areas. And an example or a flippant term I give to this in the book is the Brady rule. After superstar, probably best of all time NFL quarterback Tom Brady, who was very good, obviously, but also well known for optimizing his life around succeeding at football, like what he ate, when he ate it, how he exercised, always looking for new technologies to improve what he was doing, new data analytics, arriving early to practice, staying late, all those things, right? Like really orienting his entire life, at least for most of the year, around being the best he could be. I think if Tom Brady is willing to do all that to throw a football a bit better, then those of us, if we really care about reducing the suffering in the world, if we really care about whatever cause it is we care about, if he's willing to do that to throw a football better, shouldn't we be willing to do the same thing for this cause that's clearly much more valuable and important for the world than throwing a football better? And even for those of us that just don't have it in us to do that, we should at least admire and respect and view it as a good thing when others themselves do embrace discomfort in that way. And then very lastly, sorry for this, a very long spiel, but to your exact point, just like discomfort is important for growing in other areas, like at the gym, the only way to build muscle is to tear the muscle that you got by lifting weights or doing things like that. Like physically, that is what works. You tear it and then it builds back stronger. The same thing applies, I think, to doing good in the world or succeeding in any endeavor, right? So if it's mental energy and stamina, how can you work longer hours and get more achieved while still being reasonably happy? By getting uncomfortable and working longer hours in a way that's not pleasant. And eventually you get used to it and then it's just fine, normal. It doesn't really affect your happiness or minimally affects it. Same for just putting more effort in, not just in terms of number of hours, but cognitive effort, like how deeply we think through things, how much focused mental effort we give. And in some cases, it could carry over to the physical as well. Just as that is crucial in other areas, I think it's quite helpful for those of us who to embrace discomfort and to be willing to realize the benefits of that. For those of us who want to be the most effective and successful we can be at things that ultimately benefit others.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think it's important what you mentioned is that it's not always like a physical discomfort, right? It could be any type of doing a little bit or getting a little bit less so you can give a little bit more kind of concept. There's a lot of different examples that, this is one thing that I think could be its own podcast episode within itself. But I love that idea. And I think you might have intertwined just briefly saying we suffer a little bit more, but it's not really about suffering like we're talking about suffering in the book. It's really about just putting ourselves into uncomfortable situations so then we can do a little more. I think one example that I just thought of when you were mentioning this just now is, and this is maybe just like a very short example, but let's say you don't upgrade your seat on a plane, so you save that money and then donate it, right? It could be simple things like that. Or like you said, working a little bit longer so you can give more later. We're about to wrap up, and I think the last thing I'd love to extract from our conversation is really how to find the best charities to give to. I know you mentioned a couple different ways to. I think what you mentioned in the book was like how people typically grade like how they're going to give to a certain charity. Do they like the founder or the leader and all this kind of stuff? But any insights on how to find the best charities to donate to?
Yeah, it is challenging in part. I think practically speaking, it's not challenging. Psychologically and in reality, it is very rarely done for a couple reasons. One, in general, for most people's giving, it's not this very pragmatic calculation of I'm going to try to do the most good. It's, does this general cause interest me? And does this particular group of people who are working on that cause, do I like them? If so, I'll give to them. So much of it is about feeling good, doing some amount of good, but we don't care exactly how much, if it's a small amount, a lot, and feeling good from doing it. And so there's that. And then secondly, to the extent people are trying to measure, again, practically speaking, it's not hard to measure, but it's just that the learning to measure is difficult because almost nobody models that. Like socially, it's just not modeled. Culturally, it's not modeled. And B, most of the intermediaries that theoretically should be doing that to help donors don't do it. They model either nothing or they model the things that don't matter, like indirect indicators. This is true of the sort of the biggest name charity advice giving sites like Charity Navigator, for example, GuideStar being the two big ones. You can look on their site and you see this very complex rating system based on all sorts of things like how many board members there are, what level of transparency they provide, how much they spend on overhead, lots of things like that. But all of those all the things they measure are these extremely indirect things that bear essentially zero correlation, not zero, but quite low correlation to just actual positive impact and how much good gets done if you give them $100, $500, $1,000. And even some of the other intermediaries that try to do this similarly will look at these indirect indicators that are just different from dollars in, good out the other end. One can still do that. I would suggest that for most sectors, the way to do it is just to do it directly yourself. And anyone can do it. It's really just a matter of going in with that goal in mind. So let's say I'm somebody that cares about animals and I want to help save the lives of as many animals as I can or reduce the suffering of as many animals as I can. I can read on things online and I can probably get a sense of, okay, this type of category might be the better category for me to donate to. Like farm animal causes might be much more effective than donating to my local animal shelter. You can get some things from just reading online, ask ChatGPT, et cetera, as long as you word your query correctly. But as you get more to, okay, like I'm in the right ballpark, now how do I pick this specific charity? I think you just have to look one by one through annual reports and just have that question in mind of, okay, how many animals were actually benefited by this group's work? Not they're talking about this topic or they did one small thing and this good thing happened, but like really responsible. Like they're the ones that moved, that made something happen. And here's the number of animals that benefited. I think doing that and just looking at those numbers across a bunch of ones in a category that seems like the right category is really, unfortunately, the best way to do it right now. I think there's one or two areas where there is actually good, solid, reliable research done. For example, for those that want to reduce or save human lives or extend the healthy life years of human beings, there are a couple good sites, good entities that have done that in a pretty qualitative, rigorous way. And the metric they use and the metric they report on is that these are the charities that, by the best of our calculations, save the most lives per dollar donated. So giving what you can would be an example there. GiveWell's recommendations when it comes to human charities, saving human lives charities. I think those are pretty solid. But that's really the only area, one of the only areas I've seen where there are robust reporting sites or similar that will give the average donor just very clear numbers of, okay, $100 to this place does X, $100 to this other charity does Y. You can see what's probably doing more. I think it does require doing it yourself.
Yeah, I guess the first donation you should make is donating your time to make that, do the research. Thank you for that. Yeah, it also makes me think a lot of times people look at big organizations like the Red Cross and they say, hey, the CEO of Red Cross is making, I don't know, $5 million a year. That's outrageous. But and I don't donate to the Red Cross and I'm not saying anything good or bad against them, but some rules do require, there's only a few people that could become the CEO of such a big organization. So it's some of these headlines say, oh, don't do this because of this headline, but you really have to do your own research because the more you dig in, the more you realize, okay, what does it take to do the effect that I want to achieve? Yeah, thank you for that.
I think to your point, the most important thing is just to look at output. If you're looking at a publicly listed company in the stock market, yes, you could look at some of the underlying dynamics, but there's a couple key numbers that matter, right? What are margins? What's margin growth and revenue growth? There's a couple key numbers that ultimately tell you about the health and successfulness of this company. I think when it's evaluating our profits, the key thing is just to have those right numbers and just look for those numbers and know that's what matters. The other stuff maybe has an impact on the final numbers, but they're not really that relevant because you can just look at the final numbers themselves and know 99% of what you need to know.
effective altruism. How much do you subscribe to EA, and how does the concepts of effective altruism relate to your work, either in the book or just thoughts in general? Do you think about it a lot?
For many years, I've considered myself a utilitarian in the sense of wanting to do the most good and reduce the most suffering. And certainly that's obviously very aligned with EA, generally speaking. And so I think a lot of people who are into effective altruism would read this book and say, this is an effective altruist book, more or less. And I think that's probably the case. That said, there's also cultural connotations that are there around effective altruism and some ways of approaching things that, like, I don't share the same opinion around. I'd say I'm certainly somebody that you could describe it as an effective altruist, and it would be a good descriptive term, but it's also one of those terms that I don't use myself. I don't talk about a lot. I just prefer to think about it in the sort of terms we were using, like trying to reduce the most suffering in the world as the goal and thinking critically and analytically about that.
Thank you so much. What We Don't Do, you can get it on Amazon. There's an audiobook version. Are there any and we're going to put the link in the show notes to that and maybe a couple of the other things that were mentioned on the call today. Are there any last insights you have for our listeners?
The only thing I'd add is if any of, to your last question about, okay, how can you pick good charities or make smart decisions? If there's anyone listening that's interested in just a quick conversation or 2 cents on that, happy, of course, to share my own way of thinking around that and how I look at charities and decide where to donate and so forth. So folks can feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and nick@levervc.com is my email address. So feel free to reach out if you want to chat about these things. But other than that, nothing else. And I just appreciate you having me on, Alex. Thanks so much. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. And thanks for joining us again on the show. And we'll also link the first episode so people get a little bit more of an intro to your professional background. But thank you so much for joining us again.